anzi scientists. I love it. Hello and welcome to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Money does not talk, it screams. This is what is happening on a global scale. China's establishment of a new international infrastructure bank is a sign of these times. Beijing is rapidly making itself heard in the halls of power and finance. Is China challenging the West, or is it just going around it? To CrossTalk China, I'm joined by my guest, Amitai Etzioni in Washington. He is a university professor at the George Washington University. Also in Washington, we have Aldo Caliari. He is director of the Rethinking Bretton Woods project at the Center of Concern. Also in New York, we cross to Sara. She's an assistant professor at the State University of New York at New Paltz. All right, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Amitai, if I go to you first, China is establishing what is called the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. A lot of countries have joined it, primarily from Asia, no surprise there, but a number of European countries have actually followed suit too, against the wishes of the Obama administration. Now, this bank is going to have about $50 billion in seed capital. What is its significance in your mind?
I think we should welcome it. China has a profound need for a secure flow of energy and raw materials. When it's tried to do that by laying claims on the South China Sea and building weapon system to control the sea lanes, the West got very upset, and for good reason. Now they're trying a different approach, kind of a Silk Road in which they're going to do land pathways to Central Asia. The United States has no reason in the world to object the development of a Central Asian infrastructure which will allow China a secure flow of material essential for its economic survival. Aside from that, any increased instability and development in Central Asia is again for the benefit of world peace. It counters terrorism and it adds to government stability. So this initial reaction that anything China does has to be pushed back is really very reminiscent of the Cold War days, where containment was total. Whatever the Soviet Union did, the United States had to block, even if it wants landing rights in Bolivia or any small little thing. We would be much better off, all of us, Russia, China, United States, if we blocked military coercive expansions and welcome economic and development expansion. There is room for $1 trillion in Central Asia for development. There is no reason to worry about 50 billion Chinese dollars.
Okay, let me go to Sara here, because the paradigm of assimilate or challenge. You know, I know academics have written extensively on this, and it makes perfect sense to me. But that mindset remains in Washington. Just what we just heard there. If China's doing something, they must be up to something, and they must be pushed back. I mean, this is not new thinking in the 21st century. I mean, we do have international institutions like the IMF. I don't see why it's a security threat to the United States and the West if China wants to do something parallel. Go ahead, Sara.
I don't know that the U.S. is necessarily concerned about containing China per se. I think that they are concerned about China's record of human rights and environmental degradation. And so that is something that was stressed in the Pivot to Asia strategy, and I think that is something that Washington is reacting to right now. I think that the U.S. is starting to get on board. They've said that the Treasury Undersecretary has said that the World Bank and IMF would be willing to coordinate the financing of projects with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I think is a great sign and definitely necessary. Yeah, but at the same time,
but Sara, let me ask you here, because I mean that really gets to the core of all of this here. That's a strategy. What you just said is that China should continue to follow, and I think it's Beijing saying, why should we follow when we can lead, and not necessarily as a challenge, but as in a parallel way. And let's also keep in mind the IMF and the World Bank and other institutions, they back and support a liberalism that the West supports that China certainly doesn't domestically. domestically or internationally. Go ahead, continue, Sara.
Right. I would agree with that. I mean, I think that it's not necessarily a containment type of Cold War situation, but that it is. And in fact, Obama has said that he's not attempting to contain China in any way. But there are issues with the Bretton Woods institutions of the World Bank and the IMF in terms of voting power, governance. The U.S. has a huge amount of voting power in both of those institutions, which other nations have been trying for years to try to change. And also, China wants to improve infrastructure within the region. The region still needs about $8 trillion in infrastructure, and this will help China's own growth to develop. So it is kind of a parallel development that China is seeking.
Okay, let's go to Aldo. Aldo, you're the director of Rethinking Bretton Woods Project, which it's great that we have you on the program, because I think China is rethinking Bretton Woods in a big way.
Yeah, I think that's precisely what is happening. We have had a large evolution change in the geopolitical scene in the last 45, 50 years. And the Bretton Woods institutions have failed to reflect that. We still have, even you look at the IMF, it's still a quota formula that with some tweaking around is the same quota formula of the 45, 50s. Huh? So China is sending a message saying we are fed up with the slow pace at which the adaptation of these old institutions to the new world in which we are, by the way, the second largest economy by purchasing power parity terms. We are fed up with the slow pace of that evolution, and we are going to do some things by ourselves if that continues if that old structure continues to be unresponsive to this evolution.
You know, Amitai, when the European countries, a number of them decided to join this infrastructure bank, the Obama administration was not pleased about it whatsoever. As a matter of fact, beforehand they said, please don't go there. And the Europeans followed. And this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this program, because this is another of those tipping points here, where China doesn't have to ask for permission anymore. It's going to lead, and it is treated very badly in the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF, that is so slow to change here. And by the way, the West is exporting its values. I don't see China doing that with this institution. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it will. Go ahead.
That's exactly the point. We need a graduated response. Red light for any use of force, and a green light for ideological competition. Why should we fear competition about values or about economic projects? After all, a free market idea is competition. But I want to go back to quickly to 2 points made. First, Peter, you referred to IMF as an international institution. Well, the IMF just gave $17.5 billion to Ukraine. Yeah. Well, is that a politically neutral decision based on economic development criteria, or is that clearly a Western political move? There is no such thing as neutral institution. And second, if I may join my colleague from New York, who correctly points out that the attempts to reallocate the voting rights in the IMF and in the World Bank have been stalled. And the United States, I'm sad to say, it's my country, is playing a complicated game here. On the one hand, they ask China to join the existing international order, which was fashioned by the West and play by its rules. And when China wanted to increase its contributions to the World Bank and to the IMF, and naturally increase its voting power parallel to the size of contributions, the United States is hemming and hawing. One final point as to the notion that President Obama said that the United States is not trying to contain China. Well, unfortunately, if you look at what's happening on the ground, the United States is developing military alliances with the Philippines. It's reopening its military bases in the Philippines. It's developing military relationships with Vietnam, a country which, all the countries on the border with China. It extended its military treaty with Japan on those little islands which everybody's fighting about. It's conducting joint military exercises and very much pushing India to counterbalance China. If you don't want to call it containment, call it green apple, I don't care. But in effect, it's trying to create a broad alliance and chain of military bases all to contain China. That is limited to military moves.
Go ahead, Sarah, go ahead.
Let me just finish the sentence, sir. But it could...
I would jump in there.
Go ahead, Sarah.
So the U.S. already has thousands of military personnel all over the world, outside of the United States, and in Asia they have the most military personnel of any region in the world. So it's not necessarily that we're trying something new. It's that we're taking some of the forces from the Middle East and we're redeploying them to Asia. I don't think that's necessarily a military move.
That is incorrect.
It could be in part due to the need to protect natural resources.
Okay, Amitai, go ahead before we go to the break. Go ahead.
Yeah, just one sentence. This notion of just rebalancing is simply mathematically incorrect. The forces are being increased and not just restocked.
All right, I'm going to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on China. Stay with RT.
I love it.
Uncovering hidden stories, moving against the mainstream, going to all lengths to bring real news to Britain. I'm Afshin Ratansi, going underground to bring you the stories that really matter, only on RT.
Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing China's challenge to the West. Okay, I'd like to go to Aldo in Washington. Amitai brought up a very delicate point with me, as Ukraine, as all Crosstalk viewers know. We've done more programs on Ukraine than probably any other topic in the history of this program. And Amitai brought up a very interesting point, Aldo, because a lot of people criticize the Chinese in this infrastructure bank is that they will be pursuing their national interest, as if that's something strange. That's what states do. That's what powerful states do. That's what rich states do. They always do it. And they always will. So, Aldo, why should we be surprised that China is going to have this infrastructure bank, put a lot of money into it, and it's going to say, well, you know, we take most of the risk, so we're going to kind of point it in our direction. Is there anything particularly wrong about that?
It's the behavior that you expect from a state, like you said, and it's absolutely right that, and you don't need to go as far as Ukraine. Actually, just look at Greece. I mean, the lending that has gone to Greece compared to the lending to the traditional, so to speak, traditional clients of the International Monetary Fund, there's no comparison in the size and the scale and the risk that the institution is taking for that country. And so it is natural in any institution there will be, and you know, that's not the US, it's Europe. And so it is natural that a country would want to use institutions, particular institutions where it puts a big chunk of money, for fostering certain national geopolitical interest. And that's what China is doing. I think there is, of course, an element there also of asserting the role as an emerging power, and in the sense that this is a bank that is going to finance certain priorities, priorities of also of other developing countries. It is not just China. It is filling a gap that several developing countries feel it is not really being filled by the World Bank at the moment, or by other Western-dominated financial institutions.
Okay, Sara, let me go back to you in New York, because, you know, go ahead, jump in. No. That's the point of the program. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say that just because the United States has dominated the World Bank and IMF, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a positive thing, that other nations don't have as much ability to insert their opinion or ideology or whatever you want to call it. I think that the decision-making process should be more democratic. And I do have concerns about China's role as a decision maker in terms of implementing infrastructure. Just look at the Three Gorges Dam and what happened as a result to the environment and to the displacement of millions of people. Same thing with the north-south or south-to-north water transfer project. That's also been problematic in terms of the environment. And so I don't think we should necessarily just allow whoever is in charge to run it however they want. I think that they do need safeguards, and the Western nations that have just recently joined have stated that they were going to ensure that China follow the safeguards that other international institutions do.
Okay, Amitai.
Let me say something.
I want to talk about the ambition of China. China is a regional power. Its global interests are extremely limited. This, again, is projecting the Cold War thinking on the current situation. But there was a global competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. China has absolutely no interest or appetite or capabilities to play a really major global role. If you talk to them, the first thing they point out to you is, while it's true that their total economy is growing, because they have 4 times more people in the United States, the income per capita in China is very similar to El Salvador and Guatemala. They're still very much a developing country with huge domestic needs. Half the country is still in poverty and demanding the same as the other half. So to position China, because it's trying to develop infrastructure in Central Asia, as having some kind of global ambitions, or because they want a little more voting rights in the IMF, is simply a misunderstanding of both China's genuine needs and its ambition. The question is, we allow them a little room in their own region, which Central Asia is not part of the Monroe Doctrine. It's not an American sphere of influence.
I think, I don't know, Monroe Doctrine is kind of global these days, unfortunately. And let me go to Aldo here, because basically Sara mentioned best practices. She mentioned best practices without using the words, okay? And, that's a good point. But Aldo, let me phrase the question. But, at the same time, what are best practices? The West, look at Europe and the United States. I mean, their fiscal policies, they're in debt to the point where it may never be paid off. No wonder some European countries want to join this, because maybe they're going to be going to the trough too to be bailed out. Go ahead, Aldo.
Yes, right. That's a good point. The macroeconomic policies pursued by the IMF and the World Bank during so many decades, I would not consider that best practices. But let me reply on the specific point of safeguards, which Sara brought up. And I mean, let's demystify this idea that the World Bank is the guardian of safeguards in the world, and there is the China and other countries actually are the ones that like, so to speak, resettlements and depriving people of their rights in projects. Actually, on the one hand, you see the World Bank pretty much at this point, just very recently, the World Bank president went on record saying that they want to double lending, and that's going to mean a lot of involuntary resettlements, and basically saying that's a consequence of development. And you see the World Bank embarked in a project of reviewing its safeguards in a way that is definitely going to dilute them, in spite of promises made by the leadership that wasn't going to happen. So you don't see the World Bank really so much defending the safeguards as much as actually trying to lower them down to make sure that they are going to be the bank is going to be able to do more of these projects without having to compensate the people who are affected. On the other hand, you have China, which, yes, it may be responsible for some bad projects, but you have a country that is taking a lot of steps, for example, on its own degrees of environmental pollution. You see China responding a lot faster, even if you take into account the proportionality component of that, how difficult that is proportionally for a country like China compared to other to Western countries, responding much faster to the threat of climate change.
Go ahead, jump in.
I was in China a few weeks ago during the APEC meeting, and what China announced that is going to contribute 40 billion here and 30 billion there, and the United States announced that it's going to contribute 115 million. There's a point to that story. The United States at the moment is under extreme budgetary pressures. It's found very difficult to fund even its basic obligation. So in this environment, the notion that the United States would be able to replace China and provide the kind of huge sums needed for the global infrastructure is just inconceivable. We cannot find the funds for fixing our own bridges and railroads. So that is one more reason to welcome anybody who is willing to put money into developing the global infrastructure. Should be kissed on both cheeks.
Okay, Sara, jump in New York.
I agree with that. I agree with that. And I would also say that the Great Recession, the global financial crisis that hit in 2008, which began in the U.S., really kind of underscored that the U.S. was not infallible. And at the time, people expected that the dollar would lose significance, that the Bretton Woods institutions possibly would be remade, that this type of world order that is currently very slowly being remade would change. And those things did not happen. In fact, the power of the IMF in particular was underscored by the bailouts all over the world. And the power of the dollar was also underscored as people flew back to treasuries as a safe haven during the crisis. And so I think that other countries are finally realizing that in order to change the world order, they have to do things incrementally and on their own. It will not take an external shock to do it.
Amitai, but that's the whole point of China's policies, I would say. I mean, I would look at the American pivot to the Pacific as militaristic. I mean, that's exactly what it is. And any country a size of China and its economy is going to look at this as a threat, and that's perfectly normal. You know, NATO isn't a friendly force. You know, it bombs people to death, like Libya, okay, arming Ukraine. I mean, these are not friendly institutions, all right? But at the same time, I think the Chinese are engaging and in protecting themselves. It's a very interesting mix here, and no sudden moves. Slow, incremental change. Go ahead.
But China's military, despite modernization, is still very, very weak. They have now one aircraft carrier which they keep running into trouble every time they put it to sea. The United States has 11 of those, and they could go on and on, list you that despite the fact that they doubled and tripled, they started from such a low base that they still have, compared to the United States, a very, very weak military. So the notion that they're going to use the military to rearrange the map is really a very unreasonable one from any viewpoint. That's aside from the fact that they have some extremely pressing social needs. They have a very aging, rapidly aging population because of their one-child policy, so they have ever more old people and ever fewer children and young people. They have enormous environmental challenges. They have enormous tension, ethnic and racial, and they have their own, by the way, jihadists. So the notion that they have any reason, rational or otherwise, to seek a military confrontation with the United States is preposterous. But at the same time, they cannot survive without a secure flow of raw material and energy. They just don't have it. And they have a very hungry, large population.
All right. On that note,
4 times larger than the United States.
We've had
so they're looking to secure that flow.
We've run out of time. We've had a fascinating discussion. Many thanks to my guests in Washington and in New York. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.
I love it.